On the warm night of October 10, 2022 in Chicago, tragedy struck when Officer Ethan Monroe, a 36-year-old veteran of the Chicago Police Department, was found murdered in his upscale penthouse. Known for his sharp instincts and dedication, Ethan had a nearly two-decade career on the force. However, his personal life was unraveling, with his marriage to 35-year-old Natalie Monroe strained. Ethan spent long hours at work and was secretly involved with fellow officer Samantha Bryant. The crime scene inside the luxurious penthouse was chilling. Ethan was attacked while sleeping, and the brutality left no doubt it was premeditated. Blood surrounded the bed, indicating a swift, calculated assault. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows or damaged locks, raising suspicions of an inside job. Though a few valuable items were missing, the scene lacked the chaos of a typical burglary. Natalie, sobbing at the scene, claimed she had been asleep in another room, only to wake and find Ethan dead. Yet her demeanor struck investigators as controlled, almost rehearsed. Detective Adam Sinclair, Ethan's best friend and colleague, was one of the first to arrive. Despite his grief, he couldn't ignore the troubling lack of forced entry, knowing Ethan was cautious about security. He also knew of Ethan's affair with Samantha Bryant, adding a layer of personal intrigue to the investigation. As the investigation deepened, inconsistencies in Natalie's story emerged, and suspicions grew. The detectives realized the truth behind Ethan's murder was hidden within the Monroe household, as long-buried secrets began surfacing. The shocking death of one of their own rattled the Chicago Police Department, turning the investigation into not only a quest for justice but a search for the truth beneath the facade of grief. With Ethan's affair and his unraveling marriage, the case was already more complex than it appeared. Ethan's affair with Samantha Bryant had been ongoing for months, widening the emotional gap between him and Natalie, who, at 35, felt increasingly abandoned. Their once passionate marriage had turned cold. While Natalie had always supported Ethan's demanding career, his emotional detachment and long hours left her feeling bitter and isolated. Sitting alone in their large penthouse, she often wondered how her life had reached such a hollow state. Her frustration with Ethan grew as his absence, both physically and emotionally, became unbearable. During this period, Natalie met Lucas Harris, a 34-year-old freelance photographer with a magnetic charm and mysterious past. They crossed paths at an art event, and the instant attraction quickly blossomed into a passionate affair. Lucas provided Natalie the attention and validation she craved. As their affair deepened, she confided in him about her deteriorating marriage, sharing her anger and sense of betrayal. Lucas, with his own troubled history with law enforcement, played into her emotions, reinforcing the idea that Ethan had destroyed her happiness. Over time, their whispered frustrations escalated into dark conversations about murder. Divorce or confrontation seemed impossible to Natalie. Her bitterness had consumed her, and she began to see Ethan not as her husband but as an obstacle. Convinced that murder was the only escape, Natalie and Lucas meticulously plotted to kill Ethan, believing they could execute their plan without suspicion. Their scheme didn't take shape overnight. Over weeks of secret conversations and careful planning, they crafted a plan they believed would rid them of Ethan while keeping them beyond suspicion. Lucas's photography work had given him experience with surveillance equipment, which became crucial as he tampered with the security system in the Monroe penthouse. Natalie had installed the cameras for security, but now they were an obstacle to their deadly plan. Lucas discreetly adjusted the system, preparing for the day they would strike. Lucas carefully created blind spots in the penthouse's security system, ensuring no clear footage would capture the murder. He and Natalie scouted the area, identifying the best time to strike when Ethan would be most vulnerable, tired and disoriented after a late shift. Their goal was to stage the crime as a break-in gone wrong, leveraging the occasional neighborhood burglaries to make the story plausible. Lucas, calm and methodical, mapped out the details, convincing Natalie that success depended on patience and precision. Natalie continued her role as the supportive wife, maintaining routine with Ethan while secretly becoming more distant. Their frequent arguments would later help explain the tension in their marriage if questioned. Ethan, distracted by his affair with Samantha, saw the distance as normal, unaware of the deadly plot forming around him. Natalie never confronted Samantha, but resented her deeply, using her as a scapegoat in her mind. The plan's success relied heavily on alibis. Lucas suggested that on the night of the murder, Natalie attend a public event to ensure she had witnesses vouching for her whereabouts. Reluctantly, she agreed to host a small gathering at a local art gallery, inviting friends who would never suspect her. Lucas, on the other hand, had to be more cautious. He planned a late-night drive, creating a trail of phone pings and interactions at convenience stores, backed by receipts and time-stamped footage to prove he was miles away from the crime scene. With every detail falling into place, the night of the murder approached. Natalie felt both dread and exhilaration, but the thought of freedom from Ethan fueled her determination. Lucas, the strategist, reassured her that everything would go smoothly. They had prepared for every variable. Confident in their plan, they awaited the night they would execute not only their scheme but Ethan himself. On the night of October 10, 2022, everything was meticulously prepared. Natalie Monroe spent the evening at a nearby art gallery, ensuring her alibi was airtight. She laughed, mingled, and appeared calm, calculating every move to avoid suspicion. As the night wound down, she checked her phone. Lucas was ready. Meanwhile, back at the penthouse, Officer Ethan Monroe, exhausted from a long shift, had fallen asleep. He had no idea this night would be different from countless others when Natalie returned late from social gatherings. Unaware of the plot surrounding him, Ethan slept soundly as Natalie slipped back home quietly, preparing for what was to come. Lucas waited nearby, his car parked a few blocks away, out of view from cameras or potential witnesses. His nerves were steady, his focus clear. The key they had hidden earlier allowed him easy entry into the penthouse. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Natalie, in the guest room, lay wide awake, waiting for Lucas to act. She had rehearsed her reaction, her tears, her panic, ready to play the devastated widow. Lucas moved silently down the hallway, a heavy metal flashlight in hand, chosen for its ability to deliver quick and fatal blows. As he reached Ethan's bedroom, he could hear the steady breathing of a man in deep sleep, unaware of the imminent danger. In one swift, brutal motion, Lucas struck Ethan on the head, rendering him defenseless. He delivered several more blows to ensure there would be no chance of survival. The murder was quick and calculated, just as they had planned. After wiping the sweat from his brow, Lucas stood in silence for a moment, taking in the scene. Natalie then emerged from the guest room, calm but her heart racing. She looked at Ethan's battered body, the gruesome reality of their plan finally hitting her. There was no time for hesitation now. They had to proceed with the next step. Together, Natalie and Lucas staged the penthouse to look like a robbery gone wrong. They took valuables like jewelry and electronics, leaving other items untouched to create a believable scene. Natalie carefully placed objects in disarray to suggest a struggle. The back door was left ajar as if an intruder had fled in panic. Once the staging was complete, Natalie steeled herself for the hardest part, calling 911. She dialed with trembling hands, her voice cracking with what sounded like genuine horror as she reported a break-in and her husband's murder, perfectly executing her role in the tragic drama they had orchestrated. Natalie sobbed into the phone, gasping as she described finding Ethan's body. She and Lucas knew time was running out. The police would arrive soon, and their plan had to be flawless. Lucas slipped out of the penthouse, carefully avoiding cameras or witnesses, and drove away, sticking to his route. Inside, Natalie remained alone with Ethan's body, mentally reviewing everything: the perfect alibi, the staged burglary, and her convincing performance on the 911 call. She was confident they had covered every angle. All that remained was to play the grieving widow and let the investigation unfold. As the sound of sirens drew nearer, she felt the weight of what they had done settle in, hoping the plan would work as they had envisioned. Detective Adam Sinclair, a seasoned investigator known for his sharp attention to detail, took charge of Ethan's murder case. At first, the staged burglary seemed convincing: valuable items missing, a back door left ajar. But inconsistencies soon surfaced. The lack of forced entry was unusual. Most home invasions showed clear signs of a break-in, yet nothing at the Monroe penthouse suggested one. This small but critical detail raised questions for Sinclair. How had the intruder entered without breaking in? Sinclair also observed Natalie's behavior closely. Initially, she appeared genuinely grief-stricken, fearful, and overwhelmed during the 911 call. However, as days passed, her emotions seemed inconsistent. In interviews, Natalie grew vague and evasive when asked about her whereabouts on the night of the murder. While Sinclair was cautious about jumping to conclusions without solid evidence, the subtle shifts in Natalie's demeanor deepened his suspicions. Natalie, 35, had been married to Ethan for nearly a decade, but now the cracks in her story were beginning to show. To outsiders, Ethan and Natalie appeared to be a typical married couple, but their relationship had deteriorated in the months leading up to Ethan's death. What once was a loving partnership had turned into mutual resentment and emotional distance. Ethan, consumed by his career, had become detached, and his affair with fellow officer Samantha Bryant was an open secret among close colleagues, though Natalie seemed unaware of the full extent. Detective Sinclair decided to question Samantha, a 29-year-old officer involved with Ethan for nearly a year. Samantha had been hesitant to come forward initially, fearing the affair would complicate matters. However, under Sinclair's questioning, she revealed that Ethan had been deeply frustrated with his failing marriage and had often confided in her about Natalie's cold and distant behavior. Ethan had even considered divorce, though he hadn't taken any formal steps. Samantha's insight painted a picture of a man torn between his unhappy marriage and his desire for freedom, leading Sinclair to question Natalie's true motives. Meanwhile, Sinclair's team continued to search the Monroe penthouse for clues. There were no clear signs of a struggle, and the murder weapon had been wiped clean, adding to the sense that the scene had been staged. Sinclair's instincts told him that whoever killed Ethan knew the household intimate. Natalie's behavior raised more red flags. During a second interview, she was visibly agitated and defensive, especially when asked about her relationship with Ethan. Her timeline of events was vague and contradictory, and she avoided direct answers when questioned about her whereabouts on the night of the murder. Sinclair suspected Natalie was hiding something, but without solid evidence, he couldn't make an arrest. His suspicions weren't enough. He needed more, clear motive or proof that pointed to Natalie's involvement. As he pressed on, Sinclair turned his attention to Lucas Harris, a name that had come up during interviews. Lucas, a 34-year-old photographer, had no obvious connection to Ethan or the police, but whispers about his ties to Natalie. Rumors of an affair between Natalie and Lucas began to spread, capturing Sinclair's attention. Was there a deeper connection between them? Could they have been working together to plan Ethan's murder? Sinclair started digging into Lucas's background, carefully reconstructing his involvement with Natalie. What he uncovered only intensified his suspicions. Lucas's relationship with Natalie was far more serious than it had first appeared. Communications between them suggested a closer bond that had become more intense in the weeks leading up to Ethan's death. Though Sinclair didn't have a definitive piece of evidence yet, the picture was becoming clearer. Ethan's death wasn't random, it was personal, and Sinclair was closing in on the truth behind the facade of a grieving widow and a staged burglary. He just needed one more crucial break to tie it all together. As Detective Adam Sinclair pressed on with his investigation, the puzzle pieces surrounding Ethan Monroe's murder began to align. His suspicions about Natalie deepened when he made a key discovery. A neighbor's security camera had captured footage from the night of the murder, showing Lucas Harris near the Monroe penthouse during the time of the crime. This was the first concrete evidence linking Lucas to the scene, dramatically shifting the focus of the investigation. Lucas, 34 years old, had maintained a low profile in Natalie's life. Initially quiet and unassuming with no criminal record, Lucas had seemed like an ordinary figure. He met Natalie through mutual acquaintances, but their affair had evolved into something far darker. His background in photography gave him expertise in manipulating security systems, a critical aspect of the Monroe penthouse's security tampering on the night of the murder. Lucas's technical skills played a pivotal role in Natalie's plan. Sinclair's review of the security logs revealed an unsettling pattern. The system had been disabled and reactivated at precise intervals, right before and after Ethan's murder. The timestamps aligned too perfectly to be a coincidence. It was clear that whoever tampered with the system knew it well and had access to the penthouse. Combined with the footage of Lucas near the property, Sinclair was convinced that Lucas wasn't just an acquaintance but a key figure in Ethan's murder. Armed with this new evidence, Sinclair knew it was time to confront Natalie Monroe once again. Natalie's behavior during the previous interrogations had already raised red flags, but she had managed to avoid outright incriminating herself. However, the mounting pressure from the investigation began to take its toll, and her previously calm demeanor was starting to fracture. Sinclair noted her growing nervousness. Her inconsistent answers and defensive reactions indicated she was struggling to maintain her story. Now 35 years old, Natalie had played the grieving widow convincingly in the days following Ethan's murder, but her involvement with Lucas and the premeditated nature of the crime were becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. During the next round of questioning, Sinclair confronted her about the footage and the security logs, intentionally pushing her into uncomfortable territory. Natalie's responses became evasive, and she stumbled when discussing her relationship with Lucas. The confidence she once exhibited was eroding, and Sinclair sensed that the walls were closing in on her. Simultaneously, Sinclair focused on Lucas Harris. Despite his photography background, Lucas had displayed overconfidence throughout the investigation. He believed his involvement had been discreet, that his technical knowledge of security systems would protect him, and that his connection to Natalie would remain hidden. However, when Sinclair brought Lucas in for questioning, his arrogance worked against him. Initially, he denied being near the Monroe penthouse the night of the murder, but the security footage contradicted his claim. Faced with the evidence, Lucas's calm indifference shifted to barely concealed agitation. Sinclair understood that the key to breaking the case lay in applying pressure on both Natalie and Lucas simultaneously. Their stories had to align perfectly, and he was determined to exploit any discrepancies. Over several days he interrogated the two suspects separately, scrutinizing every detail of their timelines and interactions. As the questioning intensified, both Natalie and Lucas began to make small but critical mistakes. Their once rehearsed and coordinated stories started to unravel. Natalie's guilt manifested in her inability to maintain her facade of innocence. Her nerves betrayed her during questioning, particularly when confronted with evidence of Lucas's presence at the penthouse. She faltered when asked why the security system had been tampered with. Her earlier claims of not understanding how it worked contradicted her prior statements about Lucas's expertise. The composure she had maintained was slipping, and Sinclair could see the cracks widening. Conversely, Lucas's arrogance became his downfall. He underestimated Sinclair's persistence and the strength of the evidence against him. When asked about his relationship with Natalie, he attempted to downplay it as casual, but his story fell apart under scrutiny. The surveillance footage, security logs, and his increasingly defensive behavior painted a clear picture. Lucas had been at the Monroe penthouse the night Ethan was killed and had tampered with the security system to facilitate the crime. The more Sinclair pressed, the more their previously coordinated narratives began to unravel. Natalie and Lucas had assumed they could outsmart the investigation, but the weight of the evidence and relentless pressure from Sinclair's team pushed them into a corner. With each round of questioning, Sinclair grew increasingly confident that he was nearing the truth. Natalie's erratic behavior, coupled with Lucas's missteps, brought the investigation to a critical turning point. The breakthrough had arrived. Sinclair now possessed the evidence linking Lucas directly to the murder scene and proving Natalie's complicity. All that remained was for them to confess what Sinclair already knew. They had planned and executed the brutal murder of Ethan Monroe, believing they could escape unscathed. However, the cracks in their stories were too deep to conceal. The truth was surfacing, and Sinclair was ready to bring it to light. As he closed in on the truth, the pressure on both Natalie Monroe and Lucas Harris reached a breaking point. The investigation had revealed enough inconsistencies, and the evidence was mounting. For Lucas, the once arrogant lover, the realization that the walls were closing in hit hard. The security footage, tampered penthouse security logs, and the exposure of his affair with Natalie placed him in an impossible position. His confidence began to unravel, and he saw only one way out: to save himself at any cost. Lucas Harris, a man once caught up in passion and obsession, began to panic. The plan that had seemed foolproof now appeared as a trap that could land him in prison for life. Unwilling to go down without a fight, he made a decision that would alter the course of the investigation. Believing that cooperating was the only way to lessen his sentence, Lucas contacted the police with an offer: full cooperation in exchange for leniency. What he revealed next shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Lucas provided a damning confession, but it wasn't merely his admission of involvement in the murder that caught Adam Sinclair's attention. It was how he portrayed Natalie as the mastermind. According to Lucas, Natalie had orchestrated everything from the beginning. She had manipulated him into helping her kill Ethan Monroe, weaving a narrative of abuse and neglect that convinced him murder was the only solution. He claimed that Natalie had never truly loved him, using him merely as a pawn in her deadly scheme to rid herself of her husband and start anew. Sinclair, though skeptical, listened intently as Lucas recounted the months leading up to the murder. He described Natalie's growing bitterness and isolation, her complaints about Ethan, and how she gradually introduced the idea of murder into their conversations. Lucas alleged it was Natalie who had devised the plan to stage the scene as a burglary gone wrong, and that she had meticulously arranged the alibis and planted the spare key for him to use on the night of the murder. Sinclair couldn't dismiss that Lucas's story filled several gaps in the investigation. Natalie had always seemed more than just a grieving widow, and her behavior had raised red flags from the outset. Lucas's confession, though self-serving, provided Sinclair with the final piece of evidence needed to act. Armed with Lucas's testimony, Sinclair prepared the warrants for the arrests of both Natalie and Lucas. The arrest of Natalie Monroe was swift and sudden. Once hailed as the heartbroken wife of a murdered police officer, she was now being led out of her upscale penthouse in handcuffs, surrounded by a media frenzy. The public, who had initially rallied around her as a victim, watched in shock as the once sympathetic widow was revealed to be the mastermind behind her husband's death. Natalie maintained her innocence throughout the arrest, insisting that Lucas was lying to save himself. But the damage had been done. Her carefully crafted image was shattered, and the truth of her involvement could no longer be hidden. The trial that followed was nothing short of sensational. The media latched onto the story of betrayal, obsession, and murder, dubbing it a twisted love affair gone deadly. Every detail of Natalie's affair with Lucas Harris and her supposed manipulation of him to kill her husband was laid bare in court. Samantha Bryant, Ethan's lover, made her appearance as a witness, revealing more about Ethan's troubled marriage. Though her involvement in his life paled in comparison to the shocking revelations about Natalie, Lucas, now playing the role of the manipulated lover, took the stand to testify against her. His story painted him as a man deeply in love, manipulated by a cunning and heartless woman. He claimed that he had been driven to commit the crime under Natalie's influence, believing her when she said it was the only way they could be together. His attempt to shift the blame onto Natalie, however, didn't resonate with the jury as much as he had hoped. His own role in the murder was undeniable, and the evidence of his meticulous involvement, tampering with the security system, being present at the scene and helping stage the crime, was overwhelming. Natalie, for her part, maintained that Lucas had acted on his own. She claimed that while their affair was real, she had never intended for Ethan to die and that Lucas had taken it upon himself to kill her husband out of jealousy. But her defense crumbled under the weight of the evidence, especially the security footage, the timeline of events, and Lucas's detailed testimony. The jury, after weeks of deliberation, found both Natalie and Lucas equally responsible for the murder of Ethan Monroe. In the end, Natalie Monroe, the grieving widow who had once been portrayed as the victim, was exposed as the cold and calculating mastermind behind her husband's brutal death. Her affair with Lucas, her manipulation, and her betrayal of both Ethan and Lucas were laid bare for all to see. Lucas Harris, the man who had been swept into her web of lies and deceit, was found just as culpable. His attempts to save himself through betrayal ultimately fell short. Both Natalie and Lucas were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case that had shocked Chicago ended with a grim conclusion, as two people who had once plotted to start a life together now faced the rest of their lives behind bars. The story of Ethan Monroe's murder became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how passion, betrayal, and obsession can turn deadly, leaving only devastation in their wake. The community, still reeling from the loss of one of their own, was left to grapple with the fallout of a crime that had shaken their faith in those closest to them.